Welcome to the IR Theory interview series. Today, I have the honor to interview another great scholar, namely Andrey Makarychev. He's the author of several articles and has published extensively with a special focus on Russia's foreign policy. Today, we are going to look back at an article published almost 10 years ago and see how it can shed light on global IR and the war in Ukraine and its global repercussions. But first, welcome, Andrey.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to have you here with us today.
My pleasure.
It's really nice. But before we start the discussion about global IR and your particular contribution that I want to focus on, quite a lot actually, your article about non-Western theory or global IR. Before we do that, could you please tell us a little bit about your scholarly background?
Well, I'm originally from Russia. I spent almost a decade working in different universities in Europe, including in Germany, and since 2013 the University of Tartu in Estonia. Well, I started my professional career with political science and international relations, I would say in conventional sense of these disciplines, and then I switched to something that, as I suspected, at a certain point would disappear, and this is EU-Russia relations, and I was right. To kind of skip or to, how should I say, opt for, let's say, other research tracks, which I started exploring, well, I would say 6-7 years ago, and these are related to the whole bunch of critical theories, including critical geopolitics, including critical border studies, feminist studies, critical biopolitics as well. So that's what I'm doing, visual studies. Yeah, so that's what I'm doing right now.
A very diverse background, many different strands, theoretical strands, empirical strands in your research.
That's true.
Okay, so lovely. Let us start then. You wrote together with Vyacheslav
Morozov.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this wonderful piece about IR theory, and more specifically about non-Western IR theory or global IR theory. So the title of the article is non-Western theory possible? The idea of multipolarity and the trap of epistemological relativism in Russian IR. Before we discuss the specifics of that article, I want you to focus a little bit or say something about global IR and its promises, because today I would argue many of the more thriving theoretical discussions and debates occur under the umbrella of global IR. So what would you say are some of the major promises of global IR?
Well, I would start with something that is more or less on the surface, and this is about elucidating two different ways of going global. I think this is simple, but this is important for let's say any conversation on global IR and these promises. So one way of going global is through interdependence, interconnections, through networking. And in this sense, you can afford being small. You do not necessarily need to be really like a world power to, position yourself within this dimension. And the second way of going global is through accumulation of resources, critical resources, including military resources, economic resources, and gaining the status of great power with the satellites, with the spheres of influence, etc. And this is the kind of two different pathways. And I think what is happening right now in international relations is a kind of juxtaposition and even a competition of these two different ways of going global. And the global IR, I think, was quite instrumental in looking at how these two globalities or these two mechanisms of globalization work quite differently from each other. And of course, the concept of multipolarity is one of the concepts that is closely related to those promises in global IR. We focused our article basically on the concept of multipolarity, but this is just one of the examples of those intellectual products that we can find in the arsenal of global IR. But in the meantime, to avoid being too optimistic about that, which quite often happens, I would say that yes, on the one hand, within the domain of global IR, there are many concepts that quite easily travel from one milieu to another. Let's take, for example, geopolitics, with the key question of how spaces are organized. Or let's take, for example, I really love this debate on governmentality, the concept developed by Michel Foucault for a specific, quite specific both in temporal and in even in geographical sense, concept as a Western product, the product of Western political philosophy. But look how this concept gradually moved from its, let's say, original liberal milieu or environment to cover a much greater variety of different regimes, including illiberal, non-liberal, non-Western, etc. So I just give these examples to show how concepts can travel from different backgrounds, from different genealogies, and that's really a very strong confirmation for the validity of global IR in a broader sense. But in the meantime, well, not all promises have been properly fulfilled, and that's another part of this story. There's many of global paradigms that have been well covered in the literature. Well, they simply do not work. For example, what shall we do with the idea of the decreasing role of nation states as one of the cornerstones of any analysis of the global world? This again, on the one hand, yes, in certain sense, we do see the decreasing role of the nation state as such, but on the other hand, the concept of sovereignty, something that almost I don't know 3 decades ago we were ready to say a big farewell to, is very, I would say, consistently readjusting to the globalized world or to the globalized world, and that explains the proliferation of autocracies in many places of the world. Or, for example, take the idea of desecuritization that was also part of the global IR paradigm as it became, well, I would say, central for IR scholarship after the fall of the Soviet Union and the expectation of a new era of global development. While desecuritization exists as a very important concept that is used, I would say, in very limited number of cases, but basically through kind of softening security, making security less divisive and less producive of wars and conflicts and crises. But look, against the background of what's going on in Ukraine, well, I would say that these expectations of let's say a global desecuritizing of international politics, well, they look a little bit obsolete from today's perspective. And of course, I'm not saying about transitology. It already was bombarded by, I know, endless number of critical voices who are now ridiculing the ideas of diffusion of good practices, of democratization, of expansion of the sphere of norms and principles and values. Again, the background, what is going on in countries like Russia, Belarus, other. Well, I'm focusing on these so-called post-Soviet countries since this is my area of interest and my area of research, but definitely we can find multiple examples of pretty much the same developments in other parts of the world. And this also brings us to the idea of modernization, which was also part of global IR, that insisted on a linkage between I would say, the density of economic cooperation, of economic development, financial cooperation, and the state of political system, including the state of democracy. Well, we don't have this linkage, well, at least when it comes to this country that I have already mentioned, which basically means that well, this concept that were claiming their universal validity, their how should I say, global spread and global usage, they are not universal. They are very much context specific. The same also goes for the concept of regionalism, for example, that was always a part of global paradigm. Global regionalism is a new type of structure in political spaces all across the globe that would produce this, something positive, a productive force. Now, what we see, starting from COVID-19, that most of regional organizations are like, more like a bystanders in dealing with issues of primordial interest, etc., etc. So I would prefer a more balanced, look at these promises that definitely very important and a still important part of IR debate, and this, I would say, flip sides or let's say more problematic areas.
Yeah, I think we will touch upon some of the more problematic aspects more, and I have specific questions in relation to that. But thank you for outlining those promises and already touching upon some of the pitfalls as well. But I would just like to ask about what you mentioned there. You say there are two different ways of going global, and you mentioned interdependence, networks, and so on. One, and then a second one. You mentioned concepts such as spheres of influence, multipolarity, and so on. To me, it seems that is echoing some kind of liberal realist distinction of how to view the world, right?
To some extent.
In some sense, I mean, there are. We can look at them as empirical indicators. We have interdependence and networks and exchange and so on going on in the world, which is one way of going global. And the other way is other empirical indicators of how we can go global. But could we then add other aspects of going global as well that are linked to other theoretical perspectives? Because it seems as if these are in some sense related, I mean, shallowly put perhaps, to liberalism and realism. And then perhaps if we add Marxism, then perhaps another way of going global is to look at the globe as a global capitalist system. Or we look at the English school, going global in terms of some kind of world society, and other ways of going global. Or do I, but then you also mentioned concepts. So there is something here about going global that seems to be epistemological rather than empirical in that sense. So how can we sort that out?
Well, I think what I mentioned is just two, I would say, polar models of going global. And of course, you can find many other interpretations, and you can find many other hybrid forms. When you mentioned, for example, the English school, I think it offers a nice trajectory of transforming the international system as just a kind of space for cohabitation, in which differences are not the differences are tolerated. They're not erased. They're taken as they are, with the potential conflicts, etc. To something which is known in international society, in which norms play much more important role. So the actors are trying to find common denominators, to something even more, I would say, demanding, which is based on values like international community. So I really use these three, how should I say, three phases and three stages of going global for my own lecturing. But I still think that in this trajectory, what matters is exactly how we see the main trajectory or the main vector. Are we looking at the evolution of the global system as based on normative commitments, or we are still presuming that it's military force and its resources that matter? And to me, it's not only a theoretical question. To me, it's also something that happens in the real world. Because again, the war in Ukraine is a clear attempt to bring us back, to detach our thinking from the world based on interdependence, interconnections, normative and value-based principles of going global, to a completely different world. So I think that this competition is still there. And I think that it's both conceptual and it's both, well, let's say, practice or policy oriented.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification then. So yeah, despite the promises that you mentioned before, even though you already touched upon some of the pitfalls, you point in your article, you specifically point to the problem of epistemological relativism. Why is that a problem?
Well, what we had in mind with my co-author, Vyacheslav Morozov, is that epistemological relativism creates an impression that for studying something which is unconventional or even exotic, something very specific, very peculiar, you need equally unconventional, even exotic, unusual concepts or approaches. You need to develop your own theories to study countries that are not part, maybe so far, of, let's say, a global mainstream. And we basically had in mind the way how Russian community of political experts and IR experts position themselves against the background of global IR, very often trying to invent, to contrive something like a Russian theory of international relations. So basically, our starting point was a critique of those attempts to kind of artificially create something that would have a very limited purchase and a very limited sphere of application. And I think it also applies to, of course, you know, a broader set of issues of whether we can study, let's say, cases or study countries' political systems or political relations beyond the mainstream of the global world, with more or less universal methods, universal concept, and universal approaches. In the meantime, of course, clearly having in mind that ontologically speaking, the world is diverse and it is pluralist. So in this sense, that was our take on this dangers of epistemic or epistemological relativism.
Okay, so while the world is a very diverse place, pluralistic place, many different cultures, nations, civilizations, and so on, the scientific method, so to speak, is universal, and we need. I mean, we have to have a universal epistemology to be able to communicate with each other. Is that what you're saying, basically?
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, I think we can go much beyond this article and look at well, quite clear cases of this universality of methods that that we use. Take, for example, I know what's more or less on the surface. Take discourse analysis. Or take something which I'm more and more interested in, visual analysis, a very specific form of analysis and cognition and extracting a very important knowledge of the visual world as opposed to the world of text. So, I mean, I'll just give you this examples, which is basically reacting to what you have said about the universality of methodological or methods that we use in global IR.
Yeah, so then, I mean, in other words, there is a critique against what we could call indigenous knowledge or some other concept that we could use to, like, alternative traditions, indigenous science, other types of science. There is a critique against that.
It's hidden. It's not. I would say it's not well articulated in this article, but it's definitely what you can read between the lines.
Yeah, and that also goes against some voices, or at least some voices, a tradition within IR that emphasize that we should have more epistemologies, like some kind of, we should have some kind of epistemic, I think the concept is, like from some scholars, epistemic disobedience against Western science, against Western methods, to build on other scientific traditions and other ways of doing science, basically.
Well,
and would you say that that strand is that the common one within this umbrella of global IR, or is the voice or the perspective that you represent the common one within global IR?
Well, I will start with the first part of the question.
Yeah.
Well, definitely we have multiple epistemologies all around. And definitely we have endless number of local knowledges that might be based more on, let's say, practical experiences rather than on academic. So we definitely need to deal with that. And that's what, for example, anthropology as a discipline was dealing with for, decades and centuries. They dealt with many indigenous, quite autonomous epistemologies, different pictures of the world that might be in either in conflict with each other, or might just not need any type of let's say interaction with other forms of knowledge. But as scholars, we definitely need to study these epistemologies. The problem with let's say the development of a specific type of knowledge that would be authentic to a specific political milieu is that, again, as practice demonstrates quite clearly, the destination point for those attempts, especially when it comes to Russia, I'm not trying to overgeneralize, but when it comes to Russia, and I suspect to many other countries of this region, is that the destination point is self-isolation. I would say self-inflicted marginalization. And that's what happened with the Russian discipline of international relations and political science in general. We traced the origins of this process back in the 1990s, and it was very much, of course, motivated and influenced by political developments, but it also has its own epistemology of creating a knowledge about, let's say, our own country that would be drastically different from all those alien types of knowledge. Again, I think this is a way to nowhere. And this is, on the one hand, this is a procedural issue.
Well, sorry to interrupt. Why is this a road to nowhere?
Well, this is a road to nowhere because you cannot develop theories, you cannot develop concept in isolation with others, you cannot avoid cross-fertilization, you cannot avoid something which I would call positioning yourself against the background of other epistemologies.
There is no universal lingua franca either.
Well,
you have to know Russian to be able to engage in Russian science, so to speak.
Well, that's true, but that makes the whole issue even more complex than just denying the validity of local epistemology. I think we should be careful with this argument. Because of course, for getting deeper, for probing into, let's say, Russian or Ukrainian or Belarusian or Estonian milieu, you need to be a specialist in, in language and culture, so that you could open the door to local epistemologies. But in the meantime, I also think that there are many, again, as I have mentioned already, there are many methods that are of universal validity and universal applicability. So you do not need to deny all this to create something, let's say, from scratch. And that's what we have seen in Russian political science and international relations, just starting something from scratch. Or, which is even more, I think, problematic, is the substitution of let's say, Western theories with something which is academically, in my view, and I think in our review, quite problematic. Something that is more like ideologically driven or ideologically motivated than academically framed and academically confirmed. And the language, it's very often that happens. The language of academic analysis is just contaminated with concepts that have nothing to do with academic cognition, like, for example, historical rights, or I know, spiritual security. Well, frankly speaking, I don't understand what is all this about. And I think this vagueness of this concept, I think, is intentional, because unless you define concept, you can play with them as long as you wish. And this creates a problem. This creates a problem of the language that is very much adjusted to kind of, you know, a local milieu of discourse holders and discourse producers, and it's completely alien to those who are beyond this bubble. So that's where I see the problem. It's about language. It's about the academic concept as such.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Thank you very much for that elaboration.
What I can, and maybe I can just add a little bit to that.
You continue. I also have a question about the concept that you use, self-referentiality, but we can continue, please.
What I wanted to say is that another, I would say, problem that we have identified in or within this, how shall I say, self-isolated intellectual milieus is the resignification of concepts. So basically, and this is a quite visible trend in particularly in Russian language of political analysis and international relations as well, is that those milieus are unable to produce their own concepts, and what they do, they just infuse different meanings in already existing concepts. So basically borrowing them from the global IR language of vocabulary, but reversing or conceptualizing, reconfiguring their content. For example, I know human security might be projected onto the so-called right for intervening beyond national borders, because you think that there are kind of our people living elsewhere. It's you know, a very, I would say, clear departure from the original understanding of human security. Or, for example, the responsibility to protect, R2P, a famous concept, again, very with very clear liberal background. Well, basically, Russians resignified this concept and made it a part of Russian war machine. And this is, on the one hand, this is about a clear politicization of concepts, infusion of very specific meanings. And secondly, these resignifications, in plural, they create gaps. So sometimes when you read original texts from, let's say, perspective of Western science, you don't not necessarily get immediately into the content. What is all this about? And this also concerns, I know, the ideas of debordering, for example, the ideas of international democracy. Well, in fact, everything is resignified. And this is, I think, a problem that creates gaps and ruptures and cleavages in academic communication. When you mentioned self-referentiality, right?
Yeah, I did, and I can come back to that question. But so in some sense, there this aspect here of resignification of concepts. There is a critique against introducing concepts, first of all. I mean, before we take the resignification, you have the critique against introducing concepts that are not clearly academic concepts. They're not academic concepts. They're not rigorously or specifically defined. They're not connected to clear operational indicators, so we can find we can observe them empirically in the outside world and connect that to the concept and so on. So we have lack of rigorous definition, lack of operationalization. Instead, we have a political definition of the concept, and hence making the concept vague, vague politically, because the political meaning can change given the political necessities from time to time, but also extremely vague in terms of its academic utility. So that's one problem. Another problem is then the resignification of concepts, like you mentioned R2P now being a part of the Russian war machine, for instance. But
Right.
that makes sense, and we have seen that. But wouldn't you say that that is also a problem on the other side, so to speak? So R2P is also, just to take that example, part of a Western war machine. It was used by UK, France, United States to support military endeavors as well.
I would agree that in the Western, let's say in the Western world, definitely there might be, well, allegedly similar gaps between the academic understanding of concept and their political instrumentalization. That's what happens all the time with the concept of security, with the concept of borders, etc. All these concepts might be at a certain point politically instrumentalized, but at least there is an academic background, and there is something that we can refer to for our critique of this hyper mega politicization or instrumentalization of the concept. What is lacking in this self-referential milieus because of this, hyper politicization and because of the nature of political regime, because I think we definitely need to take into account the nature of political regime as a major factor that explains the production of knowledge or the system of production of knowledge, is that the academic layer of discourses is very thin, is very, I would say, modest, if existent at all.
Okay. So in some sense, in the West, we could then argue that at least we have two legs. We have a clear academic leg, and then we, of course, have the political leg. And you are, of course, aware that this opportunistic use of concepts, the R2P, for instance, is, of course, very common in the West as well. But on the other side, in Russian IR tradition, there is basically only a political leg, not a proper academic leg that live up to good scientific standards.
Right.
Okay.
And also what is lacking because of this self-referentiality and because of very high dependence on the whole industry of knowledge production on political regime is a clear disregard to the normative dimension of global politics, of international relations. This is something that I think is intentionally missing within the self-referential milieus. Because this is a part of the Russian, well, I would say more general Russian mainstream discourse. All these norms being products of Western intellectual and political communities does not apply to Russia. That Russia is kind of detaching itself from the sphere of Western norm. In the meantime, being unable to produce alternative. This is something which is really I would say, really missing in this self-referential milieus and an ability to produce alternatives. So we have resignifications, we have disregard for some concept, and what we don't have is what is the alternative to that. I'm not counting as alternative this mystical or mythical, concept which we have already discussed, or for example, concept with a very clear religious or theological, and in the meantime, teleological pedigree. So I'm not counting them, but they are definitely still part of these self-referential discourses. Which the last point, which I wanted to add to that, in the Western universities or in the Western academic institutions, we can, I think, still differentiate between academic and political discourses, and we know how to do that. It's much harder to make this distinction, to draw these lines in self-referential epistemological systems.
Like national schools in Russia or China or other places.
Absolutely. So they're serving the purposes of more like political elite. They're trying to be mainstream. They care about that. More than about academic freedom or freedom of expression or just the very idea of independent and critical cognition.
So then, I mean, yeah, you've already mentioned this many times, but just to bring down the point even more. So I mean, writers in China, for instance, scholars in China, they make reference to this notion of epistemic colonialism when they are justifying the need to find an alternative IR theory based on Chinese experience and Chinese perspectives and Chinese philosophy. So then this notion of epistemic colonialism, where the West is imposing a worldview, a way of being, a way of knowing, a way of looking at the world, an ontology, an epistemology on other people. In other words, some kind of epistemic colonialism. You do not really buy into that concept of epistemic colonialism then?
No, I don't. Look, Western IR, Western political theory, is the most critical of the idea of the dominant West than many other, non-Western theories. Look at the tradition of critical theories. Look at the French political philosophy. Look at Badiou, Rancière. Look at Hart and Negri. Well, they're not, buying this mainstream positioning of the Western epistemic colonialism as the kickoff point. They do the opposite. They try to do the whole idea of deconstruction, as we know, comes from the West, and it's basically Western, by its genealogy, political philosophy that created preconditions for deconstructing this, alleged colonial imposition on a certain, allegedly limited number of concepts and limited number of epistemologies. While I would, in all my career, I never faced any, case of being, ostracized or marginalized because I would go against, let's say, certain, sacrosanct, truth. It's I just don't remember seeing, if I can give a single example. What I think might motivate this critical assessments of Western intellectual or epistemological colonialism is, I think, procedural issues. We did not touch upon them, but I think they are important for many voices who would like to, be heard and listened more than they are. And this is something that really we need to discuss, because, okay, let's face it.
When you say procedural, what do you say? Procedural what?
Well,
reasons.
Elements of knowledge production.
Yeah, so procedural reasons or elements or aspects of knowledge production. Would you say, is that the same thing as, in some sense, representation? So we need more representation of alternative voices or other types of voices?
Definitely we do.
Yeah.
But I think we have endless number of academic platforms. Look at again, multiple journals on post-colonial studies, feminist studies, critical theory studies, Foucauldian studies. I mean, if you just look at the amount of ideas and concepts that they produce, I don't think that we have a clear shortage of alternative voices. And I don't see how alternative voices can be somehow intentionally suppressed or intentionally discarded or intentionally kicked out of the academic milieu. I don't think that this is possible even technically, because the state of academia in the West is, I would say, very, very, very critical towards the very idea of the domination of the West. But when I refer to this procedural or structural issue, well, it's something Foucauldian in the sense that the whole infrastructure, the whole machinery of knowledge production is, of course, very much framed by Anglo-Saxon traditions. When it comes to the pedigree, the legacy of all these schools, you mentioned the English school, the Copenhagen school, etc.
But they're not necessarily Danish or English
exactly.
or
No, they are not exactly. But they're still.
But the Russian school and the Chinese school is necessarily Russian or Chinese.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
These schools that allegedly bear some semblance to something Western, they are not necessarily Western. I would even radicalize this argument. And I would say that many of Western theories, so-called formally Western theories, that have been born out of Western intellectual tradition of critical thinking, they not only moved to, let's say, non-Western epistemologies, they were very instrumental and they were even more useful for explaining or explicating non-Western phenomena. For example, well, let me take George Agamben and his idea of bare life, homo sacer, etc. I would say, okay, being ostensibly Western by its genealogy, and Agamben himself was making more than one reference to the Western origins of this concept. Well, I think they are even more applicable to countries like, I know, again, Russia, China, all those non-Western, non-democracies.
It can travel and be applied in many different contexts.
Take the idea of society, the society of the spectacle, Guy Debord. It's late 60s, 70s, right? And it's, again, epistemological, it's a Western concept. But now if we look at the industry of making the production of the spectacle as a part of the state machinery of brainwashing, you can see that it's Russia that exemplifies the society of the spectacle. So that's what I mean by this, journeys and travels. But in the meantime, just let me come back for 1 second to the idea of the, let's say, a kind of monopoly of, let's say, English language in the sphere of knowledge production. For example, how many, French journals of international relations we know that would have a global appeal, or German language or Spanish language journals?
None, basically.
Well, very limited number, I would say. Why? I don't think it's because in these countries there is a shortage of voices of a global appeal and a global standing. No, it's because
not at all.
Exactly. So that might be a problem. I would personally be more than happy to publish something in, let's say, in German language, in French language, just to, how shall I say, expand my horizons and being more visible. So that's what I meant by the conditions of the structural condition and procedural conditions of knowledge production.
And in some sense, one could also argue that you need some kind of lingua franca as well. I mean, before we had Latin, and we had some European, trans-European knowledge production and knowledge sharing based around the use of Latin in Europe, right? And then we had the development of nationalism, and then we developed national universities in each country, and this communication was severed in a sense, and now it is regained again. I mean, of course, we had France and we had French and German in various epochs as the dominant language, but nonetheless, something happened when we created national schools and national universities as a result of nationalism. But with a global lingua franca in the English language, in some sense, we could argue that it's necessary for scholarly communication to have a global lingua franca.
Right, I agree completely.
All right. Okay, so we have already touched upon the next question. I would just state it. You don't really have to respond, but in some sense, you have the matrix in your 2x2 in your article, where you combine an ontological positions and epistemological positions. So you combine ontological and epistemological positions. The ontologically, unity of the world versus diversity of the world, and then the epistemological position, unity of science versus national schools. So in some sense, in your understanding, what is really global or universal in global IR is the scientific method, or what we could claim some kind of shared rules of scholarly communication, whereas the world is very diverse and pluralistic. That is basically the common, the kernel of the argument. But I don't know if you're familiar with Patrick Thaddeus Jackson's book on methodology.
I read some of his articles, but not the book.
Okay, this book, Conduct of Inquiry, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So there he also combines ontological and epistemological positions, and he create a very nice 2x2 also, just like you are doing.
Mm-hmm. That's very nice to know.
Yeah, so there, but he develops then 4 different types of methodologies that he argues is characteristic of the social sciences. So there is not one scientific method, simply put. There are basically 4 scientific methods, 4 scientific methodologies. So that is positivism, or he calls it neo-positivism, and then we have critical realism or scientific realism, and then we have analyticism or the Weberian tradition, and then we have reflexivity, post-structural, post-colonial tradition. So reflexivity, analyticism, critical realism, and neo-positivism. So those are 4 scientific methodologies. So even though you claim that we have to have some kind of unity of science, I mean, a universal scientific method or shared rules of scholarly communication, we could argue that there are 4 universal ways, 4 universal ways of communicating scholarly, which are represented in terms of these methodologies. So neo-positivism is one universal way of communicating, critical realism another, analyticism another, and reflexivity another. Do you see what I'm trying to get at here? Is that possible? Could you agree with that? That yes, we have to have some common ways of communication. We have to have a universal epistemology to be able to communicate as scholars, as scientists, as scholars working in academia. But there could be perhaps 4 universal ways of doing that, and then I connect to Patrick Thaddeus Jackson's methodologies.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not going to make comments on this specific methodology, but I can say that, yeah, there are many ways. I mean, 4 or 3 or 5, it depends on how we put things together. But I think that within this, let's say, typology, or what this typology demonstrates is that within, let's say, academic community, we will always have different epistemological approaches, and we'll have different ways of doing academic research, working with data, or even the very understanding of what is your data, well, would be drastically different depending on whether you study, I don't know, economic interactions, or you study visuals. So in this sense, those gaps will always be there. That's what we know, because hopefully many students would be listening to this conversation. It starts with MA thesis, whether you need to formulate your hypothesis or not. It depends on what kind of methodology you are more sympathetic with. So in this sense, yeah, there's ways of collecting data, working with data, and referring to concept will always be diverse. So this, what I'm trying to say, that this unity should not be understood in a very literal sense, as we all are sticking to one single, not like that. We basically meant the very general procedures of the validation of knowledge and the academic cognition and this type of things.
General shared rules of scholarly communication.
Exactly. Because what happens, I just one more addition to that. What happens, of course, our methodologies, well, they should be adjustable to the objects that we study. Because let me just share my personal experience of discussing those issues in, let's say, the recent couple of months with colleagues. Our original or initial research strategy or research paradigm was always very liberal, in the sense that, and this is part of the global IR, definitely. So there is an object of our research. We can get as close to this object as possible. We can go there, we can travel, we can take interviews, we can ask questions, we can go to the websites, we can look for information, and we can produce knowledge. And now we have more and more cases which suggest that not all objects of our interest would like to be studied.
Mhm.
They are kind of, transforming into black boxes. And this is a very strong methodological challenge to these scholars who study specific countries like China, Russia, Belarus, and other regimes that are like, something like black boxes. So what do you do with that? How you would study? Would you need to develop new methodologies for studying those black boxes that intentionally keep a distance from you? They don't want to be in the limelight of any, or they would intentionally supply, let's say, unreliable information just to, to make their standing a little bit more civilized and more appealing. So definitely these methodologies should be adjusted to the object that we study. That's my point.
Okay, I see. All right, let's continue with the last question. So you claim that the trap of epistemological relativism is present, particularly in Russian IR, because that is the focus of your study, and especially so in relation to the concept of multipolarity. So could you please expand on that empirical example? And also, how does this inform Russia's foreign policy in general, and more specifically in relation to the war in Ukraine? It's a big question in two questions, actually.
Yeah. Well, the concept of multipolarity, starting from the 1990s, the second half of 1990s, was one of the cornerstones of Russian foreign policy thinking in general sense, both academically and politically. So in this sense, again, it's very hard to draw a line between the two language registers. And the multipolarity initially was a part of a discourse of equality, discourse of equal treatment and justice and avoiding a monopoly of one single core, etc.
And democratization of international relations.
And the so-called democratization of international relations. It looks very ironic from today's perspective, but this exactly these reversals, these reversals that might happen with concepts, again, borrowed from, let's say, from a Western, and I would say very liberal intellectual tradition. So the lesson of Russian, language games with multipolarity is that you can start with completely innocent ideas of justice and autonomy, and then you will end up with a direct violence. Of course, I'm not saying that all strategies based on multipolarity are conducive to that, but in many respects, politically. That's a comeback to our conversation on political versus academic meanings of the concept. But politically, Russia not only just contaminated the idea of multipolarity, I think it discredited the whole idea. Because now we know that the destination point for at least the Russian version of multipolarity is war against Ukraine, against neighboring country. And this is, I think, one of the most tragic lessons that we can learn. But it's not only.
But in some sense, isn't that from a realist perspective, at least? And here you can disagree. Of course, you can always disagree. But isn't that from a realist perspective expected in some sense?
Well, expected this type of
that together with a notion of multipolarity, there is also the outcome of war.
Well, I think the realist explanation would be more focusing on not on multipolarity as such, but on these structural preconditions for the war that allegedly are shared by Western countries. At least if you have in mind Merkheimer's version of, let's say, realist explanation of the war. with the again more political than academic idea of co-responsibility of the West for what Russia did, which to me does not really make sense. I think this is very speculative type of discourse, and it's more political than academic. So if you want to have an example of politicized discourse in the West, you will definitely go for that. And I think this is a very unfortunate trajectory of the whole idea of multipolarity, whether it attests to the fact that either the whole strategy was not about multipolarity, but about something else, or to the fact that the only way how you can achieve multipolarity is to launching a military attack against others, and of course it's not good for other members of international community. Well, I don't know, and much will depend, of course, on the situation on the ground. But definitely this let's say very militaristic and very hard security-based understanding of multipolarity did not, I would say, boost, I would say, political credentials of this concept. And ultimately, I also think that it's what Russia did with multipolarity is something similar that Russia did with other concepts borrowed from, let's say, the lexicon of global IR. I remember this Russian obsession with indivisible and comprehensive security, which again was reiterated multiple times in Russian political and kind of quasi-academic discourse. It's also very much related to the preconditions for the war. Russia was expecting to get from the global world something that the global world did not promise to Russia. And Russia just not only trying to resignify concepts, but also that became clear to me since December 2021, when Putin was saying something like, we were promised indivisible and comprehensive security, give us indivisible and comprehensive security. We do not feel secure. Well, that's what a very clear indication to the fact that Russian political elite, and I think a very significant part of Russian academic community, including think tankers and including university staff, they just misunderstand the nature of this concept as being very normative. So it's not like an abstract indivisible security and comprehensive security. It is a security embedded into certain normative and institutional commitments. And that's what remained completely unread in the Russian discourse. Why? Is it intentional? Is it a political problem? Or this is, let's say, a problem of misunderstanding of the concept? That's what I don't know. I cannot say that.
Or a different interpretation of what it means for them.
Well, for them, it basically means a misreading of one of the key concepts in let's say global IR, and this is a concept of normativity, that you cannot claim your right to be secured without taking and implementing normative commitments. It's only within certain alliances and certain institutional frames that your rights for indivisible and comprehensive security might be implemented. To put it, I mean, I know that I'm oversimplifying, but that's always happens when you're trying to look at how academic concepts are projected onto political sphere. And what I see from the Russian perspective, and this is a complete misreading of the whole vocabulary of global IR, is that you can just make those claims, and then you can justify war by, again, self-inflicted sense of insecurity. On the one hand, it is a political problem, but on the other hand, it's also intellectual problem, but because it's a significant part of Russian academic community, a significant part of producers of Russian IR discourses that greatly contributed to this understanding that I'm criticizing right now. So it's not only Putin's construct; it's a construct of the whole complex or the whole set of institutions producing foreign policy discourses, with some exceptions, probably. But that's what I observe in Russia. And
so what we, in some sense, what we are serving in Ukraine is this notion of multipolarity put in practice. This is what it means. This is what Russian multipolarity means.
But that basically means that Russia does not have any other resources for becoming a pole, because multipolarity is about poles. It's about clustering resources. It's about being accepted. And again, multipolarity is very much an intersubjective construct. And that's also what Russia disregarded, again, both intellectually and politically. You cannot just proclaim yourself, okay, I'm a great power, unless you get recognition for that. And for that, you need not only military resources, you need not only nukes, but for that, you need economic resources. For that, you need normative resources. And sorry to say, you need soft power. I know that this is an overused concept, but you do need that. And it's not something that is auxiliary or something, secondary. It is primary. You do need to have your project. You do need to have your long-standing appeal to the international community to be accepted. And again, Russian approach to this concept is very instrumental. The way how they use soft power, for example, they played with this concept and they thought that for them, soft power is just a substitution to a military power, something that can be, give pretty much the same results of subjugation of countries, like Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, etc., but at a cheaper price. It did not work. So that's kind of, the result of politicization of, I would say, hyper politicization, mega politicization of these concepts that happened in Russia.
Interesting. And we have talked for a long time now, actually.
Yeah. Maybe too long.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's very interesting to listen to you. So it's my pleasure, even though it has been going on for some time now. So I think we could end there, actually. Thank you very much for that. The elaborations and the clarification of your arguments in the article and how that plays out today in the contemporary world in relation to Russia and the war in Ukraine and the concept of multipolarity and so on. Very enlightening. So thank you very much for being a part of this.
And it was very useful for myself because, each time you are bombarded by questions, you are kind of, you become much less self-referential and much more, let's say, shall I say, intersubjective?
Yeah.
Right. So you always try to extrapolate your own, small world, small bubble into, other set of ideas and epistemology. So thank you for inviting me again. That was my pleasure.
Yeah. You're welcome.